Hello and welcome to another edition of Insight, the Greater Cleveland Partnership feature that focuses upon issues of interest to the Greater Cleveland business community. I'm Steve Lutner, and joining me today is an extended panel of guests from the Greater Cleveland Partnership who are going to offer their comments and interpretations of the recently concluded May 6 primary election here in Ohio. So let's just jump right into this, Marty. Let's talk about issue 7, the so-called sin tax, the hot issue here in Cuyahoga County for the past few months. A lot of discussion about it. It passed handily, 101,000 votes roughly for and 77,000 votes against. Let me ask you this. What does it mean for the community? What does it mean for Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, the fact that this passed?
It means that we've solved the question of how we're going to fund the major capital repairs to our 3 professional sports facilities for another generation. We're lucky to be home to 3 professional sports teams. We're one of only 15 cities that have these 3 professional sports, and we needed to make sure that we would have the revenue needed to address capital repairs and improvements at some of those facilities for several years. And by answering this question on issue 7 with a yes, we've answered that for another generation.
Hard to believe that Progressive Field and Quicken Loans Arena are 20 years old.
It's very difficult.
But they have these major repairs that are looming, new roofs, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's at County Council several months ago, we walked through whole lists of the updates that were needed. These facilities are in the bottom half of all of their 3 professional sports, and it was time to make some investments in them to prolong their life.
For a market this size, we're fortunate to have 3 major league sports teams, I think.
Agreed. I mean, we're the smallest of the 15 markets that have these 3 professional sports teams. So it was important that we made this commitment, and we're fortunate that our professional sports facilities are downtown. In a lot of other areas, they're not. They're in the suburbs and in other parts of town. For us, it really leverages other economic development efforts in town and really has helped create the momentum that we now have in downtown. So it was important that we sort of asked this question and answered it so we can work on other issues and not have to worry about how we're going to address this. There were alternatives proposed that we would argue were not as good as extending what was already in place, and by doing this, we've essentially asked the question that we needed to ask. We'll haggle over how to divvy up funds and what really needs to be prioritized, but for now at least we've answered the question of how we're going to do it.
The Greater Cleveland Partnership was a prime driver of issue 7. Let's shift gears here and talk about the Cuyahoga County Executives race. Armin Budish won the Democratic nomination, no surprise there, but he faces Republican Jack Schron in November. Talk about that race a little bit. Jack Schron is a successful businessman and a county councilman himself. So how do you see that race shaping up?
We're fortunate here at GCP to have worked extensively with both candidates for that race. The challenge for Councilman Schron is just going to be the makeup of Cuyahoga County. 2/3 of the ballots that were pulled for the election that took place on May 6th were Democratic ballots. No Republican, no countywide Republican has won office other than judicial races in the last 20 years. So it's really difficult to overcome just the makeup of our county and the sort of the Democratic strength in this region. So it's really going to be an interesting race to watch. Jack, you will have to work on name recognition and other issues to really make sure voters are aware of him, but it's going to be a race to watch in November.
Thanks, Marty. Let's shift over to you, Nick, and talk about a federal race here. Congressman David Joyce, freshman congressman, Republican congressman, beat back a challenge in the Republican primary. Talk about that a little bit, how significant that was for Congressman Joyce.
Sure, I think that this election was a dry run, a test run for his campaign organization. Interestingly enough, there was a significant influx of dollars in opposition to him in the closing days of the campaign. And I think that what it showed was their ability to adjust to that. I think that also there was certainly a play by his opponent when it comes to the Tea Party backing and appealing to more conservative areas of the district, which is a Republican-leaning district, but it is not a solid Republican district. But there are areas, and I think you see it in the results that came out on Tuesday, that was where his opponent really played up his ability, and so as Joyce goes forward, I think that we will see a lot more money focused in those areas, similar to what we saw in the last 72 hours of that campaign. And this is a big district. This district goes from the eastern part of Cuyahoga County all the way to the PA line down into Summit County. So a lot of territory to cover, 7 counties.
His primary challenger in November is Democrat, is an attorney, Michael Wagar, is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that we will see, as I said earlier, we will see an influx of dollars. It's a race that's been targeted. At the end of the day, the primary was a 10-point victory for Joyce. So a double digit, I think that's what you would want to see. But we would expect that we're going to see people saying that this is that he's vulnerable, and we will see dollars come in. There'll be a lot of polling in this race, but the chips will fall where they may. But I think that it was as I said earlier, a good test drive for his campaign organization.
Now, Congressman Joyce describes himself as a conservative who's willing to work with others to get things done. Is he honing in or focusing on specific areas of importance to Greater Cleveland?
He is. He's a member of the Appropriations Committee, one of the most powerful committees. Pretty impressive for a freshman. And he's focusing on the Great Lakes, making sure that the authorization of a program, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, actually gets funded. So that funding has to come through the Appropriations Committee. And he's working with folks like Tim Ryan and Marcy Kaptur on making sure that happens. He's also very much aware of the importance of the NASA Glenn Research Center. Again, as the center and the agency gets funded, making sure that there's funding there for the center. Again, working across the aisle with Marcy Kaptur, who has both NASA facilities in her district, because they all understand the importance of NASA and the Great Lakes, not only to our region, but to the state of Ohio and to the country as a whole.
And we've saved the toughest part of this conversation for Carol Caruso, who's going to try and make some sense out of all this. Carol, kind of put overriding thoughts about politics and how they're forming here today. First thing I wanted to ask you about was this. Northeast Ohio, Cuyahoga County is still kind of a Democratic bastion, but you go 2 hours down the road to Columbus and the Ohio Senate, the Ohio House, Republican majorities. Does that complicate or hinder our efforts to move our agenda forward here in Northeast Ohio, the fact that we're Democratic majority up here and it's Republican controlled in Columbus?
Well, the beauty and the wisdom of having an issue-driven agenda is that it allows us to focus on content and relationships, and I think we do a pretty good job of that. It is definitely a Democrat area here, and you're right that in Columbus we see mostly Republicans. But by talking about issues, becoming experts on them, and really working on relationships, we're able to get a lot done. And you also have to keep in mind that we work not only with Cuyahoga County and Northeast Ohio legislators, but with leadership. We work with committee chairmen, caucus leaders, other influential legislators throughout the state. And so that certainly helps us form coalitions and drive our own agenda. So there are folks that would think it might be easier if we were in Columbus or Cincinnati, where there's a good number of Republicans, but we've found a very effective way to make it work up here.
And not so many years ago, some of those folks would hold on to their seats for decades.
Absolutely.
That changed with term limits, and there's a strong discussion on either side of that as to whether or not term limits are a good or not so good thing for Ohio. What are your thoughts about term limits?
It's a very controversial and emotional issue. There are folks on one side that think that term limits are very, very good because it brings new folks to the arena constantly, new ideas, new ways of approaching problems. But then there are other folks that really miss the fact that we do not have the institutional memory. We do not have the political history that we used to, and there are just some downsides to quote-unquote firing people just because they've been on the job for a few years. You don't see that in any other industry. So it's a very difficult issue and one that keeps coming up.
And is there any real talk of doing away with term limits or changing them?
From time to time we hear citizen groups that are interested in revisiting this, but it's probably more likely to think about extending the terms before we talk about overturning them. I'm not sure how that would go. It's a very difficult issue.
Well, it's going to be an interesting rest of the year going forward here. There's a big platter of local, state, and federal issues facing us. Marty, Nick, and Carol, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching another edition of Insight. In the weeks and months ahead, we'll be exploring more issues of importance to the greater Cleveland business community. Thanks.